Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning in. Now, Inquisition Update is going to continue our reading and discussion of this most interesting and prophetic book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. Yesterday, we began our discussion about the origins of true Bible Christianity in England. And the assertion has always been made by Rome that her Roman Catholic monk, Augustine, was the one who first planted the seeds of Christianity in England. But true history reveals that it was the missions of Paul that planted the true seed of Christ in England, that the wheat was sown in England long before the tares were ever sown. The body of Christ had sprung up. The wheat was well established before the tares were sown in. Now, R.W. Thompson cites many credible sources. These same sources absolutely discredit the Roman assertion that Christianity was first sown in England by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, we'll continue backing up a paragraph or so from where we ended last time for continuity purposes. We'll begin with the last paragraph on page 427 if you're following along in the book. Speaking of Paul's missions, it says, here in speaking of the labors of Paul as extending over, quote, almost the whole world, unquote, the inference is unavoidable that he intended to include Great Britain, which, as a Roman province, was an important part of the world. But however this may be, the fact is incontestable that Christianity in Great Britain antedated or preceded many years the mission of Augustine from Rome. And it is equally true that the British Christians had a church of their own, regularly organized, which existed independently of the Church of Rome. Even Lingard, the great Roman Catholic historian, is compelled to say, quote, that the Christian faith was publicly professed in Britain before the close of the 2nd century. And this is clear from incontestable authority, unquote. But he immediately endeavors to break the force of this admission by insisting that after this time the race of native Britons, these early Christians, disappeared before the Saxons, and that with them also disappeared their refinements and, quote, knowledge of the gospel, unquote, and that the worship of Woden took the place of the worship of God. This is not probable, if it is even possible. It is a naked assertion without any proof to sustain it. So, while Rome just can't avoid accepting the truth because it's just too plain and obvious, and admits that there was a Christian church in Britain long before Augustine ever set foot on British soil, he just destroys these early Christians saying that they were overrun by the Saxons, and that somehow the Saxons were able to snuff out the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's untenable. And we'll now make the point even more clear as we continue, beginning now where we left off last time. Speaking of this, of one of the premier historians in this British history, he references Bede. And he says, Venerable Bede refers to the deploring war carried on by the Saxons against the Britons, showing that the country was overrun by fire and sword, and the inhabitants, quote, butchered in heaps, unquote. But he says that some of them escaped to the mountains, some fled beyond the seas, and others, quote, led a miserable life among the woods, rocks, and mountains, unquote. Kind of sounds like the Waldenses, doesn't it? the Waldenses and the Albigensians and the Vaudois. God's people always flee to the mountains when they're persecuted by the Roman hordes and by the pagan Saxons. Are we to seriously believe Rome's assertion that these early Christians, those who were sown the seed of the gospel by the Apostle Paul, were just routed by the Saxons, and that the Christian faith disappeared, and that Rome simply brought it back to England? First of all, Roman Catholicism is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is the gospel of the tares. So the inference is clear. The early Christians survived, though they were persecuted, as they've always been. And then Rome sought to convert everyone to Roman Catholicism after the Saxons routed these early Christians. But as we continue, you're going to find Rome's hand in even the Saxon routing of these early Christians. It says, Rapin says, the Saxons became masters everywhere except in Wales. Okay, so Wales becomes another refuge for these early Bible Christians, these Pauline Christians, if you prefer to call them that. And it says, and Lingard himself, in another work, without entering into details, says it would be interesting, quote, to exhibit the causes which transferred the greater part of the island from the milder dominion of the Romans to the exterminating sword of the Saxons, unquote. It is not true, then, that the race of native Britons disappeared before the Saxons, and inasmuch as they were not exterminated, it is a most natural conclusion that those of them who remained in Wales and were concealed in different parts of the island retained and preserved their religious faith and church organization. All history shows that when a people are thus persecuted and driven from their homes, they cling to these with the utmost tenacity and with unfaltering courage. And this conclusion is supported by the condition in which Augustine found the inhabitants when he reached there. That there were then Christians there is undoubtedly true, and that they were all native Britons is equally true, for as is conceded on all hands, none of the Saxons were converted until afterward. It may be laid down then that as an indisputable fact that Christianity always existed in Great Britain from the time of its first introduction, that is, at all events, from the 2nd century. When Augustine arrived in Kent during the reign of Ethelbert, he came in immediate contact with an organized Christian community, having ordained priests and other church functionaries. With the assistance of the king, he assembled these together and invited them to unite with him in, quote, the common labor of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, unquote. They kept the festival of Easter according to the custom of the Eastern Christians. Remember, the Eastern Orthodox Christians observes Easter according to a lunar calendar, and the Romans, well, they observe it according to the Roman calendar. So this was an easily identifiable difference between Eastern and Western Catholics. And they kept the feast. They determined, the Eastern sect determined the feast of Easter the same way the Jews determined the feast of Passover. So when Augustine came to England, he found Christians observing the Eastern, or some would even say the Jewish Passover, or Easter, as they called it. Another indication that this was an apostolic church, not Roman at all. It says they kept the festival of Easter according to the custom of the Eastern Christians and not that of Rome, a fact which goes to show that they had not then submitted to the Council of Nicaea and were consequently independent of the Roman Catholic Church. And, quote, They did several other things which were against the unity of the church, unquote, in the Roman sense, that is, against the supremacy of the Pope. Thus, having their own church organization and their fixed principles of religious faith, they declined to, quote, comply with the entreaties, exhortations, or rebukes of Augustine and his companions, but preferred their own traditions before all the churches of the world, unquote. Then it is said, the pretended miracle performed by Augustine of restoring a blind man to sight extorted from the Britons the concession that he was a preacher of the divine truth. Nevertheless, they declared, quote, that they could not depart from their ancient customs without the consent and leave of their people, unquote. A second synod was subsequently held, no more favorable to Rome than the first. At this assemblage, there were present, on the part of the British Christians, 7 bishops, quote, and many most learned men, unquote. To these, Augustine proposed that if they would consent to keep Easter and administer baptism according to the custom of the Roman Catholic Church, and unite with him in the propagation of the Word of God among the British people, he would, quote, tolerate all other things, unquote, they might do, that is, if they would only recognize the sovereign supremacy of the Pope over them, that they could believe and do whatsoever else they pleased. The papal proposition was again rejected. The British Christians continued to prefer their own to the religion of Rome, and at once the true spirit of Roman propagandism was displayed. Seemingly conscious of being supported by a strong and aggressive power, Augustine replied to these humble, intolerant British Christians in words of insolent defiance and threat, quote, that in case they would not join in unity with their brethren, they should be warred upon by their enemies. And if they would not preach the way of life to the English nation, they should at their hands undergo the vengeance of death, unquote. Did Augustine design this language as a threat? The language itself is susceptible to no other meaning. And if the foregoing quotation shows truly what he said, there's no room for doubt about it. The extract is taken from Bede, whose accuracy is not doubted by anybody, and who undoubtedly understood Augustine as threatening vengeance against these British Christians because they would not consent to obey the Pope. No contrary interpretation could ever have been given to his words, had not the defenders of the Pope's supremacy found it necessary to break the force of this object to their system of ecclesiastical organization by placing Augustine in the attitude of making a prophecy and not a threat. See, Rome loves to threaten and acts on those threats. But here now they're trying to twist this threat into a prophecy. Now it says, hence we find Lingard, one of their standard authors, instead of quoting truly from Bede, representing him as putting his language into the mouth of Augustine, quote, know then that if you will not assist me in pointing to the Saxons the way of life, they, by the just judgment of God, will prove to you the ministers of death, unquote. See how he twisted his words? And turned a direct threat into a prophecy. Okay? Now, let's find out what this strategy is all about. He said, let the reader compare these words with those of Bede, and he will see at a glance how the latter were perverted. Bede does not say a word about the judgment of God, which was to fall upon the Britons for their disobedience, or that they were to be providentially punished by having the Saxons become the quote-unquote ministers of death to them, or anything that can be tortured into such a meaning. Lingard is inconsistent with himself in putting these words into the mouth of Augustine. He had but a little while before said that before that time the Britons had, quote, disappeared, unquote, before the Saxons. And yet, in order to change that threat of Augustine into a prophecy, he has the British Christians still existing as fit subjects for Saxon vengeance. You see the contradiction? Bold-faced contradiction. And it says the papacy, however, requires far greater inconsistencies of those who enter upon its defense. In this particular case, it required the invention of a new set of words, and Lingard has supplied them. And seeming indisposed to dwell upon them, he follows them with this single sentence, quote, he did not live to see the prediction verified, unquote, using the word in the sense of prophecy. But it is clear that the language of Augustine, as recorded by Bede, does not bear this interpretation. Other words are found at another place in his history, wherein he is represented as speaking of the, quote, prediction of the holy bishop Augustine, unquote. Referring to the murder of, quote, about 12,000, unquote, of the unarmed monks of Bangor by the Saxon king, a convert of Augustine, for no other offense than that of praying for the success of their countrymen and refusing obedience to Rome, he says this, quote, thus was fulfilled the prediction, the prophecy, in other words, of the holy bishop Augustine, though he himself had been long before taken up into the heavenly kingdom, unquote. If these words are really such as Bede used, they are inconsistent only with the supposition that the language of Augustine was that given by Lingard. But we have seen that this language is in every essential particular different, and therefore are justified in looking upon this last extract at least with some degree of suspicion. If, however, it is accurately taken from the original, it is but the construction which Bede placed upon the language of Augustine, which he has handed down to us, and which we can interpret for ourselves. Now, when it is considered that the words of Augustine were that the British Christians, quote, should be warred upon by their enemies, unquote, and, quote, should at their hands undergo the vengeance of death, unquote, and further, that he did not, as Lingard alleges, say one word about, quote, the just judgments of God, unquote, which was to fall upon them, his plain and obvious meaning must have been that he would employ the means necessary to bring about this result. In other words, that as it was a part of the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church that force could be rightfully employed to compel obedience to the papacy, he would teach this to the Saxon kings, his converts, and incite them to the bloody and murderous work. Why otherwise did he omit any reference to the quote-unquote judgment of God? And why, if the meaning of his language was, as given by Bede, were not perfectly clear and did not mean a threat instead of a prophecy, has it been considered necessary to substitute other language for it, not used by Bede, entirely perverting the original meaning? There can be no other conclusion fairly arrived at from the whole account of this transaction as given by Bede than that Augustine had reference to his own agency and not to the providence of God in bringing about the punishment of these humble, Pauline British Christians for no other offense than that of adhering to their ancient customs and preferring their own traditions in preference to the customs and traditions of Rome, and of choosing to obey their own bishop rather than the Pope. What was there in all this that God should curse them for, or should cause, quote, about 1,200, unquote, of their number to be butchered in cold blood? Is it not time that the world should hear no more of such debasing superstition as this, that the vengeance of God will fall upon all who oppose the papacy? When we now see all the Roman Catholic governments of the world destroyed, the temporal scepter of the popes broken, no king or prince or people on all the earth having either the power or the will to defend the papacy, and the Protestant nations and peoples marching forward with marvelous and unchecked prosperity in the full sunlight of intellectual, moral, and material development. Now remember, R.W. Thompson is speaking in 1876. In 1876, the Protestant Reformation had arisen, a rejection of the papacy. The Bible had been given into their hands, and they recognized after reading the Bible that the papacy fulfills every prophecy regarding Antichrist. And they came out of that church, and they stripped the papacy of all the lands that it had acquired through indulgences and other forms of gratuitous buying their ways to heaven. Rome was destitute morally, and now the world recognized it and was willing to cast out the Pope and his priests. And they formed for themselves a new government, not a government by divine right headed up by the Pope, but by constitutional republics that gave the people rights, that gave them freedom of worship and freedom to speak and to criticize the Pope and the King. 1876, the world was still enjoying the liberties brought about by the Protestant Reformation, the universal recognition that the Roman Catholic Church was the synagogue of Satan, not the Church of Christ. Are we to believe now that the world should leave the light and go back into the darkness of Roman tyranny? This is the message of this entire book. Let us not forget our ancient enemy of the gospel, the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the sequel shows how well Augustine accomplished his design, how true he was to the teachings of Rome, how different was his method of propagating the gospel from that practiced by Christ and his apostles. They went among the humble and obscure, the poor and the unlettered, but he dealt only with the Saxon kings. And for what purpose did he use the Saxon kings but to rout the true gospel from Britain in order to reestablish papal tyranny? Now, continuing just about where we left off before the break. The sequel shows how well Augustine accomplished his design, how true he was to the teachings of Rome. How different was his method of propagating the gospel from that practiced by Christ and the apostles. They went among the humble and obscure, the poor and the unlettered, but he dealt only with the Saxon kings. And when he had brought these to realize that the best means of preserving their crowns was to adopt a system of religion which taught at its very starting point the necessity of passive submission and obedience to authority, he succeeded in so training his new converts as to cause them to murder the harmless British monks merely for praying that the British Christians, their own countrymen, might be able to defend themselves successfully against these Roman Christians. At the Battle of Carlegion, where the attempt was made to destroy them for maintaining their ancient religion. You see the difference between the gospel, the true gospel of Jesus Christ and true Bible-believing Christians, and that of the Roman Catholic Church? One uses the Spirit of Christ and gentle persuasion and sound reason. The other uses force. One uses prayer and the other uses the sword. The manner in which Beatty relates these events must excite the fire of indignation in every honest Christian heart, although more than 12 centuries have passed. It was the beginning of religious persecution in England, and at no one time since then has bloodier work been done. When the poor British monks went out to pray at the battle, taking no part in the conflict of arms, and Ethelbert, one of the converted Saxon kings, was informed of it, he said, quote, "If then they cry to their God against us, in truth, though they do not bear arms, yet they fight against us because they oppose us by their prayers," unquote. Then out of 1,250, 1,200 of these praying Christians were cruelly butchered for refusing to acknowledge the Pope of Rome as the head of their church. And thus did papal vengeance and papal intolerance begin their work of bloody persecution at the very first plantings of Romanism in England. To Rome, all other Christianity than its own was and yet is still barbarism. And therefore the sword was drawn to hew down these poor Christian Britons, not because they did not worship God, but because they would not obey the Pope. And thus we learn what papal writers mean when they tell us that Augustine first carried Christianity into England. With them there is no Christianity except that which comes from Rome, none which does not acknowledge entire and passive submission to the Pope, none that does not put the Pope in the place of God on earth. Thus introduced, the papal power was preserved in England for hundreds of years by the authority of kings who were held in obedience to Rome by that part of its religion which teaches that they govern by divine right, that they derive their crowns not from the people, but from God, through the Pope, as his sole earthly representative. Whatever occasional conflicts about spiritual and temporal jurisdiction may have arisen between these kings and the popes on account of personal interest or ambition, this sentiment has been common to them all. Differ as they may about other things, they have always agreed on this, because it keeps the people in subjection to them. None understood better than that those who select the rulers of a nation are its masters. The papacy has always taught that the people have no right to govern, but are bound to the duty of obedience to princes. Therefore, the popes have never hesitated to invoke the assistance of armies of princes in carrying on the work of popular subjugation. In other words, the subjugation of the people. They have caused mercenary hordes to be turned loose upon harmless and inoffensive people as the Albigenses and the Waldenses without the slightest, quote, compunctious visitings of conscience, unquote, for no other purpose than to bring them down into a condition of inferiority and subordination. And when they have thus made princes minister to their ambition, they have held them in a like subordination by threatening to devastate their dominions. Thus England was governed for centuries with the load of papal tyranny pressing the weight of a mountain upon her. Her kings kept no faith except that which bound them to Rome, and the popes were always ready to release them from their most solemn obligations and to sanction the most enormous crimes when the interests of the papacy required it. Offa, one of the Romish kings of the Heptarchy, invited Ethelbert, king of the East Angles, to visit his court under the pretense of marrying his daughter. But that he might become master of the East Anglia, he violated the sacred laws of personal honor and hospitality by his assassination. To quiet the remorse of a guilty conscience, he went to Rome to obtain the pardon of the Pope, who, availing himself of the opportunity of extending his power and enlarging his jurisdiction, readily granted it, quote, on condition that he would be liberal to the churches and monasteries, unquote. That says the historian, being, quote, the way of atoning for the sins then. A guilty conscience drove this king to Rome to get absolution for his crime, as though he were Christ on earth. But being not Christ on earth, but Antichrist on earth, he subjected that king even further, brought him closer and more under the enormous weight of his even more enormous fictitious pretensions. Offa repaid this act of pardon by the Pope in a manner which subsequently proved most fatal to the happiness and prosperity of England. One of the West Saxon kings had already established at Rome a college for the education of English youth, and had ordered a penny to be collected each year for every family for its support. Offa extended this tax over Mercia and East Anglia, and thus was originated the celebrated Peter Pence, which came to be afterward claimed by the popes as a tribute from the English to St. Peter and his successors, and which they converted to their own use for many years and until it was abolished by King Henry VIII. But King Offa did more than this to degrade his country and to show how completely he had become the vassal of the Pope, who was at that time Adrian I. The Pope sent 2 legates to England with a code of ecclesiastical laws. Here's your Roman Catholic canon law coming to England now, carefully prepared by himself, which he required to have introduced there for the government of the kingdom. These legates called 2 synods, one of which met in Mercia and was attended by King Offa in person, and the introduction of this papal code as the law of England was, under his influence, consented to. You see how this works? One of the bargains the papacy always uses, on threat of war if necessary, that the nation adopt Roman Catholic canon law, the decrees of the papacy, which are built, as we have studied so carefully, fictions and frauds and usurpations and lies. And this is how this code of canon law was adopted in England. And we see the very same thing happening right here in the United States today, as R.W. Thompson so eloquently warns back in 1876. He continues, he says, and thus a power was built up in England sufficiently strong to govern the country without reference to the people or any responsibility to them, but responsible only to the Pope. What these laws were can now be learned only by comparing them with others which have grown out of the papal system. But it may be safely assumed that the papal clergy were by them, these laws, freed from all responsibility to the domestic laws of the kingdom, and were by these means erected into a privileged and irresponsible class, looking only to the Pope for direction in all things. Pope Adrian I, whose character may be inferred from what has been elsewhere said, we have been satisfied with nothing less than this. Into what a condition of humiliating degradation, therefore, was England dragged down when the nation and the people were laid at the feet of the papacy. It was the price of her obedience to papal despotism, the result of the quote-unquote Christianizing influence of Rome upon her Saxon kings. But it was impossible to destroy the attachment of the native Britons from their ancient religion, for that form of Christianity, which they believed to have been derived from the apostles. Excuse me, I'll read that correctly. But it was impossible to destroy the attachment of the native Britons. Remember, these are the Pauline Britons, the Bible-believing Britons, for their ancient religion, for that form of Christianity which they believed to have been derived from the apostles, as it was also impossible to break their courage. Courage always defines God's people, doesn't it? Quit you like men. We have Christ on our side. That's where the courage comes from. We have the gospel, the truth on our side. No matter how much we are outnumbered, we still have Christ and the truth on our side. We know the ending from the beginning because Christ gave it to us in the Scriptures. Hell will not prevail against the true body of Christ. So these early British Christians, these Pauline Christians, had the truth. And that truth was their might and their courage. And it says they and the Saxon common people had mingled together until by association and intermarriage their former prejudices had been worn away, and they now constituted a peaceful and homogeneous society. They had acquired all the leading characteristics necessary for a new and more vigorous nationality. The Britons imparted to the Saxons some of their ideas of religion and Christianity, while the Saxons, in return, imparted to them some of the principles of civil government they had brought with them from the valleys of the Elbe and the Eider and the Rhine. Yet they were held in tight subjection by their princes, who were themselves held in equally tight subjection to the popes. The people were surrounded on every side by remorseless oppressors and had to rise up under this tremendous weight by slow degrees and through sufferings it would require many volumes to detail. The Saxons belonged to the Teutonic or the Germanic stock and differed essentially from the Latin race which clung to the shores of the Mediterranean. Having succeeded as early as the 4th century in resisting the aggressions of the Roman Empire, they formed a confederacy which laid the foundations for their quote-unquote progressive greatness. Although overwhelmed by the armies of Charlemagne, their influence was never entirely eradicated, and their distinctive principles were preserved through every variety of fortune. These principles have always been, from the date of their first confederation, quote, singly propitious to human improvement, unquote. At the time of their settlement in England, they had their chiefs, or war kings, who were carefully held in subjection to the popular power, that is, power of the people. And when they elected a king, quote, their consent in the Gemote continued to be necessary to the more important acts of his authority, unquote, thus showing that they were not governed without their own consent, even by their kings. So the Saxons picked their own kings and held their kings in subjection. That's the quality of belief that was brought by the Saxons to England, and together with the true gospel became a power that Rome could not resist. Now it says their religion was pagan, these Saxons, yet after their conquest of England there's no evidence that they ever interfered with that of the native Britons, that is, true Christianity, until after their kings yielded to the influence of Rome. And what did Rome do to them? Subjected them to the papacy and then ordered them on a crusade against the Bible-believing Christians, the Britons. Now, we have seen that the religion of these native Britons was at no time eradicated after the first introduction of Christianity, but on the other hand, that it was preserved and cherished by the people. Hence, as the Saxons found Christianity there, it was impossible that they could have escaped its influence, as it was also impossible that the Britons could have escaped the Saxon influence. The common people had no motive to prompt them to engage in the work of exterminating each other, and to assert that they did so, except when constrained to it by the policy of their kings and the dictations of the popes, is utterly incredible. And it is not at all probable that any others than those who composed the respective armies ever engaged in this work. In other words, while the kingly classes warred against one another, the people found peace and harmony. All right? The gospel was sharing itself peacefully with those who picked their own kings and held their kings to account. Okay? Out of this grew the race known as the Anglo-Saxons. All right? Indeed, there is little in history more certain than that the body of people, Britons and Saxons, especially in the remote districts, mingled together in friendly association so as to impress each other with their respective sentiments and opinions. By this kind of influence they became at last molded into one people, and there is much in their subsequent history to show that each imparted to the other principles and elements of character which still impress Anglo-Saxon institutions wherever they exist and distinguish them from those which have been erected by the Latin race. It cannot be doubted that the Saxon idea that the people were the source of even the kingly power was readily accepted by the native Britons, who yet knew nothing about hereditary kings or their divine right to govern. Nor can it be doubted that after the Saxon kings had become obedient servants of the popes, they labored assiduously to eradicate this principle, which had been inherited by the Saxon people from their Teutonic ancestry. These kings were captivated at once with the idea that they got their power from God through the Pope and not from the people. For they could easily understand, ignorant as they were, that if the people could make, they could also unmake kings. And hence they became ready and willing converts to the papal teaching, to a doctrine which confirmed their power to them. They cheerfully accepted a religion so congenial to their tastes, so necessary as the means of promoting their ambition. Rome has always understood well how to teach this to kings, and the latter have generally been apt and submissive pupils, quick to learn and slow to forget. There's no satisfactory evidence anywhere that the body of the Anglo-Saxon people ever assented to the doctrine of the divine right of kings until it was taught as a part of the religious system of Rome and imposed upon them by force. There is abundant evidence, however, to show that the partial and interrupted dominion of the Northmen in England, which continued for more than 2 centuries, was enabled to destroy the early Anglo-Saxon influences. On the contrary, these influences remained impressed upon the popular mind and were occasionally exhibited in the struggles of the people to throw off the yoke of their kings in obedience to the popes had fastened on their necks. But whatever may have been the result in the internal course of events, of the mutuality of the intercourse and sentiment between the native British Christians and the Saxons, they were in the end brought completely and compactly together under a common nationality and jointly exhibited those qualities which achieved their triumph in all their contests with the kingly and papal power. And when they succeeded in ultimately creating the English nation, they so stamped upon it with their common sentiments and opinions that in its wonderful progress it has absorbed even its conquerors, until in this day the whole world is influenced by its laws, its language, and its character. See what happens when people put the law of God over that of the Pope? We have the English nation, one of the only truly Protestant nations in the world. And we get her heritage. Anglo-Saxon, British, based on the gospel. And the common characteristic of all of it is it rejects out of hand all of the pretensions of the papacy and the divine right of kings. If there was one thing that made this country great, it was the standard adopted by these Anglo-Saxons. Now, the Norman conquest under William the Conqueror carried into England a fresh supply of papal influences. At the death of Edward the Confessor, Harold became king by the almost unanimous consent of the nation. He was elected by the Witan, or the Witan, if you might prefer, with the full approbation of the people, quote, in the exercise of their ancient and undoubted right, unquote, and was, quote, acknowledged as king by every earldom and every shire in England. He was king alike by the will of his predecessor, by the choice of his people, by the consecration of the church, and by the homage of the themes and prelates of England, unquote. But William, Duke of Normandy, set up a claim to the throne based upon pretexts which, if they had been valid, would have conferred upon him no right whatsoever under the laws of England. He pretended that Edward had made to him a gift of the English crown before the selection of Harold as his successor, and that Harold had violated his oath to marry his daughter and to pay homage to him. William was a devout son of the church and submitted willingly to the direction of the great Lanfranc, prior of Bec, and the foremost man in the Church of Normandy. Whether the plan was concerted by both of them or originated in the fertile brain of the latter is of no consequence, but it was agreed that William should submit his claim to the decision of the Pope, that is, that the Pope alone should decide who should be King of England, without any regard to the wishes of the people or the authorities of the nation. And so goes the papacy, ruling supremely over the kings of the earth, causing wars and revolutions, wars and rumors of wars, and it'll be that way until Christ returns. Know who is the source of the wars in the world. Tomorrow on Inquisition Update.